Captain Evans looked with disdain at the 78-year-old man who had just been brought to the port. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald R had been dead in the water for 3 days, and the best naval engineers in the region had failed. When Evans heard that this old man had been called in to fix the ship, he laughed arrogantly and said in a sharp tone, "My engineers are the best, and they couldn't find the problem. An old man fixing this? I'll quit the Navy." What Evans didn't know was the legacy of victories that man carried within him, and perhaps by the end of the day, he'd have to keep his word. Evans's laughter echoed across the pier, breaking the heavy silence surrounding the USS Gerald R. Some sailors passing by slowed their steps, turning their faces away to hide their discomfort. The carrier, massive and motionless, looked like a giant forced into slumber, its turbines cold for 3 long days. Harold Miller stood still, his worn brown leather jacket draped over his shoulders and a weathered toolbox in his right hand. His blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, showed no irritation. He simply looked at the ship like a man seeing an old friend after decades apart. Evans kept going, now addressing the nearby engineers, some holding tablets, their faces marked by fatigue. "You hear that? The Admiral sent for this," he said, gesturing dismissively toward Harold. "While you, graduates of the best universities with decades of experience, can't solve the problem." The engineers exchanged uneasy looks. It was no secret that Captain Evans had an inflated ego, but publicly humiliating a veteran crossed the line of basic respect. One of them, a middle-aged man named Morgan, stepped forward, trying to calm the situation. "Captain, maybe we should at least hear him out. Admiral Carter trusts him, and—" "Admiral Carter isn't here right now, Morgan," Evans interrupted, folding his arms. "And as long as I command this ship, decisions go through me. That man might have fixed steamboats a century ago, but the Ford is state-of-the-art. Integrated systems, nuclear propulsion, digital controls. This isn't a place for nostalgic amateurs." Harold, who hadn't spoken a word until then, finally did. His voice was calm, deep, without a hint of confrontation. "May I come aboard?" Evans laughed again, softer this time, but still dripping with sarcasm. "Sure, Grandpa, go ahead. Look all you want. But when you can't fix anything, I want you to admit, in front of everyone, that you came here just to waste our time." Harold gave a small nod and began walking toward the gangway. His steps were slow but steady, no rush, no hesitation. Just the pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Morgan and another engineer, Johnson, followed him. Unlike Evans, they seemed genuinely curious. Over the past 3 days of failures, every diagnostic pointed to the same issue: critical pressure loss in the propulsion system. Yet no part replacements, no software adjustments, no calibrations had worked. The ship simply refused to respond. As they climbed aboard, Johnson moved closer to Harold. "Mr. Miller, I know who you are. I've read about your work in the 80s on the Nimitz-class carrier propulsion systems. It's an honor to have you here." Harold gave a faint smile. "Thank you. But honor is a big word. I just fix what's broken." Johnson smiled back, but Harold was already focused on the ship again. As they walked across the deck, he gently touched the metal surfaces, as if sensing temperature, vibration, or something only he could perceive. They descended through narrow stairways and brightly lit corridors until they reached the propulsion control room. Harold stopped at the entrance for a few seconds. The room was wide, filled with monitors, digital panels, and control consoles. 3 engineers were there, reviewing the same data for what had to be the 1,000th time. A young man named Davis looked up and frowned when he saw Harold. "Who's this?" "Harold Miller," Johnson replied before Morgan could answer. "He's here to help." Davis sighed, clearly exhausted. "With all due respect, we already have enough people here. One more is just going to get in the way." Harold said nothing. He simply walked up to the main console and studied the screens. His eyes moved quickly across the data, surprisingly fast for a man his age. He didn't touch anything, didn't ask for explanations. He just observed. After a few minutes, he turned to Morgan. "I want to see the engine room." Morgan hesitated, but Johnson nodded. They left the control room and went down 2 more levels, through corridors that grew progressively hotter. The ambient noise changed as they approached the ship's heart, a steady hum from auxiliary systems still running, though the main engines remained lifeless. Inside the engine room, Harold paused again. The massive turbines stood silent, like sleeping giants. Complex pipes ran in every direction, and the air still carried a trace of residual heat. Harold set his toolbox on the floor, opened it, and took out a small flashlight. He began walking around the turbines, shining light on specific areas, crouching now and then to examine details no one else had noticed. Johnson followed closely, fascinated. Morgan stayed back, torn between curiosity and loyalty to Captain Evans. "What are you looking for, sir?" Johnson finally asked after several minutes of silence. Harold didn't answer right away. He continued his inspection, touching pipes, listening, as if the ship itself was speaking to him in low tones. Then, he stopped in front of a specific section of the fuel delivery system. "This ship isn't broken," Harold said quietly, almost to himself. "It's being choked." Johnson and Morgan exchanged confused looks. "Choked?" Morgan repeated. "What do you mean?" Harold stood up, pocketed the flashlight, and looked directly at them. "It means the problem isn't where you've been looking." Without another word, he walked back to his toolbox, pulled out a small notebook from the inside pocket of his jacket, and started jotting quick notes. Johnson felt a chill down his spine. There was something in the old man's posture, calm, precise, assured, that told him this wasn't just another consultant. And maybe Captain Evans should start worrying about that promise he made back on the pier. Harold closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. His eyes scanned the engine room once more, as if piecing together an invisible puzzle in his mind. Johnson and Morgan waited, unsure what to expect. The silence was broken only by the steady hum of the auxiliary systems. "I need to see the maintenance logs for the past 6 months," Harold said, still looking at the turbines. "Especially everything related to the ventilation and cooling systems." Morgan frowned. "Ventilation? But the issue is in the propulsion. The sensors show a pressure loss in—" "I know what the sensors say," Harold interrupted, just as calmly as before. "But sensors only show symptoms, not causes." Johnson exchanged a quick glance with Morgan, then nodded. "I can get the logs. It'll take a few minutes." As Johnson left, Harold turned his attention to a specific section of the room. He approached a set of ducts running parallel to the main turbines. Kneeling down slowly, supporting himself on one knee, he pressed his ear against one of the ducts. He closed his eyes and stayed like that for several long seconds. Morgan, uncomfortable with the silence, tried to make conversation. "You really worked on the Nimitz-class ships?" Harold opened his eyes but didn't move. "Worked on 4 of them," he said, his voice distant, as if speaking from another time. "The last one was the USS Abraham in 1989. I was younger, of course, but ships don't change as much as people think." Morgan crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Mr. Miller, the Ford is completely different from the Nimitz. It's another generation, another technology." Harold slowly stood, brushing the dust off his pant leg. "Technology changes. Principles don't." He looked straight at Morgan. "A ship like this doesn't stop working by accident. Something's holding it back. When you understand a ship for what it really is, you can hear what it's trying to tell you." Morgan didn't reply. There was something about the way Harold spoke that left him without words. It wasn't arrogance or defiance. It was simply deep knowledge. Johnson returned with a tablet, its screen full of spreadsheets and reports. "Here are the last 6 months of maintenance records, inspections, part replacements, everything." Harold took the tablet and started scrolling through the data. His fingers, steady and precise despite his age, moved easily across the interface. Every now and then he stopped, read carefully, and scribbled notes into his notebook. Johnson and Morgan watched in silence. After nearly 10 minutes, Harold handed the tablet back and pointed to a specific line in the report. "Here, 3 months ago, complete replacement of the engine room ventilation filters." Johnson looked at the screen. "Yeah, that was standard preventive maintenance. What's wrong with it?" Harold walked to a ventilation grate near the ceiling and pointed at it. "These new filters, are they from a different supplier than the originals?" Morgan checked the tablet and nodded. "Yes. The previous contractor had some issues. We switched to another one approved by the Navy." Harold slowly nodded as if things were finally falling into place. "And nobody tested the airflow after the installation." Johnson opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. He looked at Morgan, who seemed just as surprised by the question. "No, we didn't think it was necessary. The filters were certified. Same technical specs." Harold sighed, not out of frustration, but like someone who'd seen this happen before. Specs on paper aren't the same as performance in practice. He walked back to his toolbox and pulled out a small digital device. "This ship generates enormous heat. If ventilation isn't running at full capacity, the heat builds up. And when heat builds up, the sensors start sending false readings. They interpret it as a pressure drop, but it's actually thermal interference." Morgan stepped forward, now genuinely intrigued. "You're saying the problem's thermal? I'm saying the ship's struggling to breathe." Harold powered on the device and started taking temperature readings at different points in the room. And when it can't breathe properly, all systems switch to safety mode. That's why the turbines won't start. It's not a failure, it's protection. Johnson felt a lump in his throat. 3 days of non-stop work, dozens of engineers, millions of dollars in diagnostics, and the answer had been there all along, hidden in something as simple as ventilation. Harold kept recording temperatures, jotting each reading into his notebook. Then he walked to the auxiliary control panel and asked Johnson to activate the ventilation system at maximum power for a few minutes. The hum of the fans intensified, and a strong airflow began circulating through the room. Harold returned to the same spots he had measured earlier and repeated the process. His eyes narrowed as he compared the numbers. "Almost a 15-degree difference in some areas," he said, showing the device to Johnson. "That's enough to throw off the pressure sensors. They're far too sensitive to sudden thermal shifts." Morgan rubbed his face, processing the information. "So, if we switch back to the original filters, or adjust the airflow from the new ones," Harold finished, "the ship will breathe again. And when it does, the turbines will come back to life." Johnson looked at Morgan, and both men shared the same expression. Relief mixed with shame. Relief for finally understanding the issue. Shame for having overlooked something so basic. Harold put the device away and closed his toolbox. "I'll need access to the main ducts, and a team to handle the adjustments. It won't take more than a few hours." Morgan nodded, still processing everything. I'll coordinate the team. Johnson, stay with Mr. Miller and help with whatever he needs." As Morgan hurried off to prepare the crew, Johnson looked at Harold with something close to admiration. "How did you know? How did you know where to look?" Harold closed the toolbox and gripped its handle. "Because I've heard this ship breathe before. And when you know the sound of a giant's breath, you know when it's choking." Johnson said nothing more. He simply followed Harold, who was already walking toward the main ducts, ready to bring the steel giant resting in the heart of the harbor back to life. 2 hours later, the engine room was alive with activity. A team of 6 technicians worked under Harold's direction, each movement coordinated by his precise gestures and brief instructions. Johnson stayed by his side, translating when needed, and watching every step with growing admiration. Harold had identified 5 critical points in the ventilation ducts where airflow was restricted. In 3 of them, the new filters matched the specs on paper, but had been installed in ways that created extra resistance. In the other 2, the seals were imperfect, causing pressure loss and hot air recirculation. "Loosen this section here," Harold said, pointing to a segment of ductwork. "And check the joint seals. If they're even slightly misaligned, they'll cause turbulence." The technicians worked in rhythm. Harold didn't need to raise his voice or assert authority. Every command was followed with quiet respect, as if everyone understood they were in the presence of a man who truly knew his craft. Morgan returned to the engine room with 2 more engineers. He carried an updated report and wore an expression caught between urgency and hope. "Mr. Miller, Captain Evans wants to know how much longer this will take. He's getting impatient." Harold didn't look up from his work. We'll finish the adjustments in 30 minutes. Then I'll need 15 more for preliminary testing. If everything checks out, the ship can start the turbines in under an hour." Morgan nodded but hesitated before leaving. "The captain also asked me to confirm that you actually know what you're doing." Harold finally looked at him. There was no irritation in his gaze, only a weary understanding. "Tell the captain he's welcome to come see for himself, but I can't stop working to explain what I'm already doing." Morgan swallowed hard and left. Johnson, who had overheard, felt a mix of admiration and discomfort. Harold wasn't being arrogant, just focused on what mattered. The minutes passed with clockwork precision. Harold checked every adjustment, tested the seals by hand, and measured temperatures again. When the last bolt was tightened and the final filter repositioned, he asked for the ventilation system to be set to partial power. The hum of the fans filled the room again. But this time, it was different. Smoother. Even. As if the ship was finally breathing without strain. Harold walked slowly through the same points where he'd taken temperature readings before. At each one, he jotted numbers in his notebook. Johnson followed, holding the tablet with the previous data for comparison. "Temperature's dropping," Johnson said, almost in disbelief. 3 degrees in under 5 minutes. Harold didn't answer, but a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He continued measuring until he finished every point, then stored the device and turned to Johnson. "Now let's test the turbines." Johnson's pulse quickened. This was the moment of truth. If the turbines didn't start, everything would have been for nothing, and Evans would have all the ammunition he needed to humiliate Harold further. They returned to the propulsion control room, where several engineers were already gathered, including Morgan and Davis. Everyone watched the monitors with tense anticipation. Harold stepped up to the main panel and asked Johnson to initiate the turbine ignition protocol. Johnson looked at Morgan, who nodded silently. His fingers trembled slightly as he entered the commands. The panel lit up with a sequence of green lights. A low rumble began rising from deep within the ship, slow at first, then building like the awakening of a long-sleeping giant. The turbines began to spin, slowly gaining speed. The engineers stared at the screens, transfixed. No alarms, no faults, no interruptions. "Stable pressure," Davis announced, disbelief in his voice. "Temperature within parameters, RPM increasing as expected." Morgan exhaled deeply. Johnson closed his eyes for a moment, feeling relief flood through him. Harold stood still, watching the data on the screens with his usual calm. But there was something different in his eyes now. Not pride, quiet satisfaction, the kind of peace that comes from finishing what you came to do. "Take it up to 70%, Harold said. "Let's see if it holds." Johnson followed the order, and the turbines responded flawlessly. The sound grew into the deep roar of a carrier at full power. The floor vibrated beneath their feet, and even the air seemed thicker with the energy of reawakened machinery. Davis turned to Harold, shame and respect mingling on his face. I owe you an apology, sir, for doubting you." Harold nodded once, saying nothing. He wasn't the kind of man who needed apologies or recognition. The running ship was answer enough. Morgan stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Miller, on behalf of the whole team, thank you. You saved this ship and probably our careers too." Harold shook his hand. "I just helped it breathe again." At that moment, the control room door burst open. Captain Evans stormed in, face flushed, eyes wide. He looked at the screens, the readings, the glowing green panels, and finally at Harold. The silence that followed was heavy. Everyone waited for his reaction. Evans opened his mouth, but no words came. His fists clenched, veins standing out on his neck. Harold met his gaze with the same calm as always. No defiance, no superiority. Just patience. Evans finally spoke, his voice hoarse and low. "How?" "Ventilation," Harold answered simply. "The ship was suffocating. Now it's breathing." Evans looked around, seeing at the engineers, the monitors, then back at Harold. His expression shifted. The arrogance faded, replaced by something harder to name. A mix of humiliation, reluctant respect, and the painful realization that he'd completely underestimated the old man. Harold picked up his toolbox. "With your permission, Captain, my work here is done." And without waiting for a reply, he walked out, leaving behind absolute silence, and a ship finally alive again. Harold left the control room and walked through the corridors of the USS Gerald R. Ford with the same steady cadence he had when he first arrived. The sound of the turbines now echoed through the metal walls, a living roar that filled every inch of the ship. To him, that sound was music, confirmation that the sleeping giant had finally awakened. When he stepped onto the deck, the late afternoon light greeted him. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the ocean breeze carried that familiar salty scent he'd known all his life. He stopped for a moment, looking out toward the horizon, taking a deep breath. Behind him, Johnson came running, breathless. "Mr. Miller, wait!" Harold turned, toolbox still in hand. Johnson stopped in front of him, trying to catch his breath. Aren't you going to stay and watch the ship depart? Admiral Carter will be here in a few hours. He'll want to thank you in person." Harold smiled faintly. "That's not necessary. The ship's running. That was the job. But Captain Evans—" Johnson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He made a promise, said he'd resign from the Navy if you pulled this off." Harold shook his head slowly. "Promises made in arrogance are rarely kept, Johnson. And that's not what matters. What matters is that this ship will sail, that the men and women aboard will carry out their missions. The rest, that's just wounded pride." Johnson stood quietly for a few seconds, letting the words sink in. There was a wisdom in that man that went far beyond machinery. "You've taught me more in a few hours than I've learned in years of engineering," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Harold placed a hand on the young engineer's shoulder. "Keep listening to the ships, Johnson. They always tell you what's wrong. Most people just forget to stop and listen." They walked together toward the gangway. As they descended to the pier, Harold noticed a few sailors had stopped to watch him go. There were no cheers, no exaggerated celebration, only silent looks of respect, the kind that don't need words. Morgan was waiting on the dock, and beside him, to Harold's surprise, stood Captain Evans. Harold stopped in front of them. Evans had his arms crossed, face still flushed, but there was something different about his posture now, something that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Miller," Evans began, his voice tight as if every word cost him effort. "I underestimated you. I was wrong, and I embarrassed myself in front of the entire crew because of the promise I made." Harold didn't respond right away. He just looked at Evans with that calm, steady gaze that defined him. "Captain, you don't owe me anything, but maybe you owe something to your engineers." Evans swallowed hard. There was no comeback for that. Only a slow, heavy nod. Harold walked toward his old 1986 Ford F-150, parked near the base gate. He set the toolbox on the back seat and climbed in behind the wheel. The engine rumbled softly, a sound both familiar and comforting. As he pulled away, Harold looked in the rearview mirror. The USS Gerald R. Ford stood tall against the orange evening sky. Its turbines thundered at full power, the ship breathing again, ready to return to the sea. Johnson, Morgan, and even Evans stood on the pier, watching as Harold's truck disappeared down the road. He drove along the coastal highway bordering the harbor, and for the last time that day, he looked toward the ship. Bringing giants like that back to life, that was what kept him going. That was purpose. And in that quiet moment, Harold knew he had fulfilled his. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about unsung heroes who deserve to be recognized.